September 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. 60 German women POWs couldn't believe they were served steak in camp. Erika Muller braced for the worst. She was an enemy Red Cross nurse. She was trained for interrogation and hunger. Instead, a US Army cook slid a piece of steak onto her tray. This act followed every rule of the Geneva Convention. But this strange mercy felt more like a test than kindness. Soon, Erika would discover there was a hidden reason for this treatment, a secret that had nothing to do with forgiveness. If your enemy feeds you with one hand while hiding a cold strategy with the other, is it mercy or is it a weapon? We invite you to share your city and local time in the comments. We're interested where these accounts reach. If truth and dignity in war matter to you, please subscribe. September 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. 60 German women POWs couldn't believe they were served steak in camp. Erika Muller braced for the worst. She was an enemy Red Cross nurse. She was trained for interrogation and hunger. Instead, a US Army cook slid a piece of steak onto her tray. This act followed every rule of the Geneva Convention. But this strange mercy felt more like a test than kindness. Soon, Erika would discover there was a hidden reason for this treatment, a secret that had nothing to do with forgiveness. If your enemy feeds you with one hand while hiding a cold strategy with the other, is it mercy or is it a weapon? The air that hit them was not the dry, familiar heat of Italy, where they had been captured 3 months earlier. This was a wet, heavy warmth that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It clung to their worn uniforms as the boxcar door slid open with a jarring screech of metal. For a moment, no one moved. 60 German women, most of them nurses from the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, blinked in the punishingly bright Louisiana Sunday. They had traveled for days in the dark, rocked by the rhythm of the rails, their futures a terrifying blank. Propaganda films had painted a clear picture of what to expect from Americans. They were told the enemy was undisciplined, cruel, and vengeful. Capture meant humiliation at best, starvation or execution at worst. Erika Muller, a 28-year-old nurse from Dresden, felt the cold steel of the cuffs that had been removed only an hour before, a ghost of pressure on her wrists. She stood straight, her training taking over where courage failed. Do not show fear, do not show weakness. Then, a scent reached them, carried on the humid breeze. It was so unexpected, so completely out of place, that it felt like a hallucination. It was not the smell of disinfectant or boiled cabbage she associated with military life. It was the rich, unmistakable smell of grilled beef. Whispers broke out among the women in the soft Swabian dialect of their home region. It had to be a mistake, a trick. Perhaps the American officers were having a feast, and the prisoners were meant to smell it as a form of torture. The guards, tall men with tired eyes, gestured for them to move. Their boots crunched on the gravel as they were marched in a line toward a series of long, low buildings. No one spoke to them. No one shouted. The guards simply walked, rifles held loosely, their silence more unsettling than any threat. Erika watched the dust rise around her worn boots, focusing on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. All around her was a sprawling camp, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, holding over 4,000 Axis prisoners. But they, this small group of 65 women designated Group W, were a rarity. They were medical staff, not frontline soldiers. And in the eyes of international law, that made them different. They were led into a large hall that was plain, clean, and filled with the clatter of metal trays. It was a mess hall. A line had already formed, and they were pushed toward it. Erika picked up a tray, its metal, cool, and solid in her trembling hands. Her stomach, long accustomed to thin soup and hard bread, clenched in a knot of fear and hunger. She moved down the line, her eyes downcast. A spoonful of mashed potatoes, white and steaming, landed on her plate. Then a green vegetable she did not recognize. A thick slice of white bread and a small bottle of milk followed. At the end of the line, a broad-shouldered American soldier stood over a grill. He was a black man, a fact that struck Erika with the force of a physical blow. Her training films had been very specific about what she could expect from black soldiers. They were savages, she had been told, incapable of mercy. This man did not look at her. His movements were efficient, practiced. He lifted a piece of steak from the grill with a pair of tongs and, without a word, slid it onto her tray next to the potatoes. It was not a thin, grey slab of overcooked meat. It was thick, seared, dark at the edges and still pink in the center. Erica stood frozen for a second, the line behind her pressing forward. She found a seat at a long wooden table, placing her tray down with careful, deliberate motions. She stared at the food. The steak was real. The steam rising from it was real. Hilda Schulze, a senior nurse who had become the group's unofficial leader, sat across from her, her face a mask of disbelief. Hilda picked up her fork and poked at the meat, as if checking for poison. A few of the younger women were already eating, ravenously, their fear forgotten in the face of such a meal. But Erica could not lift her fork. Every instinct screamed that this was a lie. Food like this was for heroes, for victorious armies. In Germany, even before the worst of the bombing, a meal like this was a distant memory. Her own wounded soldiers, the boys she had tended in field hospitals, were fed watery broth and ersatz coffee. They died hungry. This was not prison. This was a banquet. And it made no sense. They said the Americans hated them. They said that American women, whose sons and husbands were fighting in Europe, demanded revenge. They said the prisoners would be put to hard labor, left to rot in filth. So why this? Why the clean barracks? Why the full meal? Why the steak? Erica looked from the food on her tray to the impassive faces of the American guards standing by the walls. Their discipline was absolute. This was not chaos. This was a system. And as the truth of it began to dawn on her, a new, colder fear replaced the old one. This strange, impossible kindness was not an accident. It was a policy, and she had no idea what it meant. The first week was a silent battle fought with forks and spoons. Every meal, the women inspected their food, their movements stiff with suspicion. They searched for shards of glass, for the telltale bitterness of poison. The American guards watched them from a distance, their expressions unreadable, which only deepened the mystery. But poison never came. Instead, the meals arrived with the steady, predictable rhythm of a hospital ward. By the 10th day, the tension at the long wooden tables began to crack. A quiet laugh was heard. Someone dared to ask for a second helping of bread. Hilda Schulze, the pragmatic senior nurse who had seen the worst of the fighting in North Africa, began keeping a diary. In it, she wrote, "Meat. Fresh. Hot. More than our wounded ever saw. Is this how they treat enemies?" The answer, they soon learned, was yes. It was required. The policy was governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, a set of rules that dictated prisoners of war must be given food equal in quality to that of their captor's army. The camp commandant, Captain Warren Reiser, was a former lawyer who treated the convention not as a suggestion, but as an unbreakable code. The women were officially classified as non-combatant detainees, a strange, sterile term that left them in a state of limbo. As Erica later recalled, "They said we were non-combatant detainees. We said we were forgotten." The full, brutal logic behind this humane treatment was revealed to Erica one afternoon. She overheard a conversation between two American officers, one of them a doctor. They were discussing the dire situation for Allied prisoners in German hands. In camps like Stalag Luft 3 in Sagan, American airmen were surviving on 800 to 1200 calories a day, a diet of moldy bread and coffee made from roasted acorns. The US Army's strict adherence to the Geneva Convention was not just about morality, it was a strategy. It was insurance. By treating German prisoners well, they hoped to pressure Germany into doing the same for their own captured sons. The kindness was a shield, meant to protect men thousands of miles away. The comparison stung Erica with a deep personal shame. The steak on her plate suddenly felt heavy, paid for by the hunger of American prisoners. She tried to explain this impossible reality in a letter to her sister back in Dresden. She wrote of the clean barracks, the English lessons they were offered, and the food. "They feed us like nurses, not prisoners," she wrote. "But I cannot say this out loud. You would not believe me." The letter never left the camp. A military censor returned it to her. The paragraphs about the food struck through with thick black ink. She was trapped in a comfortable cage, unable to communicate her reality to a world that would assume it was a lie. The deepest crack in her worldview, however, came not from a policy document, but from a quiet, daily interaction. The Reich training films she had been forced to watch were vivid in her memory. They showed American women spitting on German wounded. They warned that black soldiers were savages who would show no mercy. Yet every day, the man who served her meals in the mess hall was a black soldier, Private Thomas Green. He was a tall man from Alabama who moved with a quiet deliberation, his work in the hot kitchen, methodical and disciplined. For weeks, they exchanged no words. Then one evening, as he placed a piece of fried chicken on her tray, he met her eyes for the first time. He must have seen the confusion and shame she could no longer hide. Quietly, so no one else could hear, he said, "Food is food. Doesn't matter what uniform you wore." In that simple sentence, an entire pillar of her indoctrination collapsed. Here was a man, considered inferior by her own government, showing her a decency that felt more profound than any official rule. It was a moment of grace that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Months passed. The routine of Camp Ruston became its own form of reality. Then, in May of 1945, everything shattered. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The news arrived not with celebration, but with a series of horrifying reports that were posted on the camp bulletin board. Accounts and photographs from the liberation of Buchenwald, Dachau, and a women's camp called Ravensbrück. The German women gathered and read them in stunned, sickening silence. The images of skeletal bodies, the descriptions of systematic starvation and cruelty, were beyond comprehension. Erica stumbled back to her bunk and collapsed, the sobs tearing through her with a force that left her breathless. The other women sat on their beds, their faces ashen. All the food they had eaten, every slice of steak, every bottle of milk, turned to poison in their memories. One of the younger nurses, a devout girl named Anneliese, whispered into the terrible silence, "We were fed like humans, and we didn't feed our own." That night, lying in the dark, Erica listened to the quiet weeping that filled the barracks. The propaganda had been a lie. The mercy of her enemies was a strategy. Everything she thought she knew had been wrong. She whispered a question into her pillow, a question that would haunt her for decades. Was I ever on the right side? Or just the Fed side? The gates of Camp Ruston closed behind them in the fall of 1946. For 2 years, its predictable routines and baffling comforts had been their entire world. Now, they were going home. The journey back across the Atlantic was the reverse of their capture, a slow, crowded passage toward a future that was even more uncertain than their captivity had been. Erica Müller stepped off a train in Hamburg into a ghost city. The familiar scent of the harbor was gone, replaced by the smell of coal smoke, wet ruins, and a pervasive, lingering dust that seemed to have settled over everything. The city of her youth was a landscape of rubble, skeletal buildings clawing at a grey sky. Here, survival was a daily, desperate struggle. The official food ration was 900 calories a day, less than what the American prisoners had received in German camps. People were thin, their faces etched with a hunger that was more than just physical. They were hungry for news, for normalcy, for a future that wasn't built on top of graves. But for Erica and the other women from Camp Ruston, repatriation was not a welcome return. It was a judgment. Neighbors who had lost sons on the Eastern Front looked at their healthy complexions with suspicion. They were not seen as survivors. They were seen as collaborators, women who had lived in comfort while their nation starved and burned. One evening, huddled around a small, smoky stove, Erica tried to explain it to her sister, Liselle. She spoke of the Louisiana camp, the clean barracks, the strange, orderly life. Then, she made the mistake of mentioning the food. She described the first meal, the impossible slice of steak. Liselle, who had spent the final year of the war digging bodies out of bombed-out buildings, stared at her, her face hardening into a mask of grief and rage. She stood up, her voice a low, trembling hiss. "Steak?" she said. "They fed you steak?" She pointed a shaking finger at Erica. "Your food came from our dead." The words struck Erica with more force than any physical blow. In that moment, she understood that her experience was a story that could not be told. It was an insult to the suffering of her own people. She never spoke of America again. For 35 years, the memory of Camp Ruston was locked away, a silent, heavy stone in her heart. She poured her discipline and her training into rebuilding a life. In the 1950 seconds, she became a midwife, bringing new life into a broken world. She never joined a political party, never attended a rally. She had seen where belief could lead. In a small wooden box where she kept her nursing certificates, she kept one other item, a single, folded piece of paper. It was her meal schedule from the camp. The paper yellowed and creased, the words U.S. Army still visible in faded purple ink. Sometimes, late at night, She would take it out and look at it, the only proof that her memory was real. When people would occasionally ask her what the worst part of the war was, expecting a story of bombs or field hospitals, her answer was always the same. The lies, she would say, on both sides, and the stake. Then, in 1981, a letter arrived. A young professor from a local university was conducting a research project on the treatment of German prisoners in Allied camps. He had found her name on a repatriation list. He wanted to interview her. Erica almost burned the letter, but something, a need she had suppressed for decades, made her agree. They sat in her small, tidy living room, a tape recorder on the table between them. The professor asked gentle questions, and for a long time, Erica gave clipped, factual answers. Then he asked about her first day at the camp. She started to describe the train, the heat, the fear, and then she described the smell of the steak. Her voice, so controlled for so long, finally broke. The story of that first meal came out in a flood of tears she had held back for nearly half her life. It wasn't the food, she wept, the words raw and painful. It was what it meant. I was an enemy, a prisoner, but they fed me like a nurse. That's what broke me. Not the bombs, not the fighting. That. The professor listened patiently. When she had finished, he leaned forward slightly. Do you think it was kindness? He asked. Erica wiped her eyes and looked at him, a lifetime of confusion finally settling into a hard, clear truth. No, she said, her voice steady now. It was discipline, and that's stronger than hate. The interview in 1981 opened a door that had been sealed for decades. Speaking the truth of her experience, even just once, seemed to release some of the pressure that had built up inside her. 13 years later, in the humid summer of 1994, Erica Müller, now 78 years old, returned to Louisiana. An American veterans group was holding a reunion near Ruston, and she traveled there not as a guest, but as a quiet observer, a ghost visiting the site of her own strange history. The camp itself was long gone, the barracks and barbed wire erased by time, reclaimed by Louisiana pine and scrub. Now, it was just a small town going about its business, with no visible scars to show that thousands of men and a handful of women had once been held there as enemies. The past was a layer of earth buried beneath the present. On her last day, she walked into a small diner on the edge of town, the kind with red vinyl booths and the smell of coffee and fried food hanging in the air. She sat at the counter, and when the waitress came over, she ordered a steak, medium rare. It felt like a final, necessary ritual. As she ate, slowly savoring each bite, she was no longer a frightened young nurse, but an old woman making peace with a memory. An older man sitting a few stools down overheard her quiet, precise German accent when she thanked the waitress. He turned to her, his face weathered and kind. He asked if she was visiting for the reunion. When she explained, cautiously, who she was, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He told her he had been a boy in Ruston during the war. He remembered the camp, the convoys of trucks, the rumors that flew around town. He smiled a little, a flicker of local pride in his eyes, and said he remembered the stories about the German women held there. We fed y'all, didn't we? He asked, his tone one of simple, genuine curiosity. Erica looked at him, and for the first time, she felt no shame, no need to hide or explain. The question was not an accusation. It was just a fact, shared between two people who had stood on opposite sides of a long-forgotten fence. You did, she replied, her voice clear and steady. Better than we fed our wounded. The man simply nodded, accepting her words as the truth they were. And in that simple, unburdened exchange, the weight of nearly 50 years of silence finally lifted. Erica lived another 9 years after that trip. She continued her work as a midwife for as long as she was able, a quiet, respected figure in her community. The peace she had found in that small Louisiana diner seemed to stay with her. When she passed away in 2003, at the age of 87, her family found a short, handwritten note left with her personal papers. It was not a will or a final testament, but a reflection, a single page that held the conclusion to a question she had lived with her entire adult life. The note read, "No war is just, but kindness, real kindness, can survive it. Even when it is part of a plan, I was hungry for truth, and in an enemy camp, I was fed." The final line was written at the very bottom of the page, the words clear and certain. The final verdict on a life defined by a single, impossible meal. The stake was real. and so was the mercy.